Hi artists, this video is a follow-up to the video about making your 3D form of your North Carolina animal. And one thing to mention before we start paper macheing would be my suggestion, especially if you have an animal that stands on two legs, would be to get a piece of cardboard to make a pedestal that it can stand on. I just cut a piece of cardboard and put a piece of tape holding each foot in place. And that's just going to give it a more stable surface to stand on. For your supplies for this, you're going to need small pieces of torn paper, no bigger than hand size, but that's also going to depend on areas that you're working on some. The other thing you're going to need is your glue mixture, so your mixture of flour, water, and salt mixed to about pancake thickness. And what I'm going to do is dip that in, wipe it off because you want it wet but not drippy, and then I'm going to be putting that on my sculpture, and my goal is to try to cover the whole thing with paper mache. One big difference, if you were in art last year at Lincoln Heights, if you remember, we were talking about how with the piggy banks you had to cover everything 3 times. That's not the case with this sculpture. You only have to cover your sculpture 1 time. The main reason for covering your sculpture 1 time in this case is to unify everything. So the paper mache is going to be gluing everything together. I like to think of it kind of like an M&M, in the case that your 3D form that you made out of tape and newspaper and recycled materials, all of that is kind of like the inside of that M&M, but it needs that hard outer shell to hold its shape. So the paper mache is your hard outer shell that you're using to cover everything with. So one of the things that I try to make sure I do is where I have 2 joints, like where this head is meeting this body, I want to make sure that my pieces are touching both of those, because then that's going to unite everything together. So our goal with this is that everything should be covered with paper mache. One thing that I'll typically do, and this is just me, is that I'll save the small places for last. So like this beak, I would usually save for last, but for the purposes of this video, I'm going to show it to you now. But usually I tell you to use palm size pieces. For pieces that are small, I'll make my pieces a little smaller than that, and then what I'll try to do is tuck that inside if I can. But if you have trouble covering up tiny pieces, it's okay, as long as the majority of it is covered, as long as that tape is covered, then you're going to be okay. Because tape, any kind of tape, isn't meant to hold something on forever. Tape isn't permanent, but paper mache will hold it on for a very long time. So I have some paper mache that I made more than 20 years ago, and it's still holding strong. So if you do it well, it will certainly last. But your goal is to cover everything. So what I'll tend to do also, and this will be another tip for you, is if I have thin pieces like these wings, if I have thin pieces like those wings, I'll try really hard to make sure that I really wring those out. And you can do a couple of things with those. So let's talk about details for a minute. So most stuff you're going to try to do as smoothly as you can. if I want to give some detail to like this wing, I might cover the whole thing up first with just a general layer. But one way you can start to add details is you can actually fold pieces into a shape. So like say I wanted to look like it had feathers, I could fold over my newspaper into more of a feather shape, and I can use those to give it some texture. So you can use your paper mache to give it details. So I could fold all of these like feather shapes and then lay those on there, and that'll start to give it a really interesting kind of texture and pattern to this wing that will be much more interesting than if I had just covered it flat. Do you have to do that? No, but it's a way that you can add more detail to your sculpture if you choose to. But so your main goal with this is to cover it top to bottom, cover everything with paper mache so that in the end all you see is the paper and glue. The type of paper you use is up to you and what you have. So newspaper works great. You can also use notebook paper, you can use copy paper, like stuff you would put through a printer. Basically whatever kind you have. Typically I use newspaper because it's inexpensive and it's pretty thin, so don't use really thick paper. It's a little harder to work with. You could also use magazine paper, and that would then give you some color to it. So that's an option for you as well, especially if you want it to be colorful. But you could also color this with markers even when you're done if you use regular paper. But try to get it all covered up, and I hope it turns out well. I would love to see pictures of it when you're done. Happy making!